Welcome to Women of Steel with me, Miriam Grace, the podcast where women who've had their mettle tested help us make important links for ourselves. I talk to remarkable women about their lives and challenges through the lens of my own work as a psychotherapist. We uncover stories which challenge the power of the status quo and validate the voices of marginalised or disadvantaged women. Rosie Wilby is an award-winning comedian, podcaster, speaker and journalist. She regularly appears on radio and TV, commentating on sexuality, dating and love, and was dubbed the Queen of Breakups by BBC Radio 4 following the success of her podcast, The Breakup Monologues. She has extensively explored heartbreak in her podcast, in her hugely successful comedy shows, and in her first book, Is Monogamy Dead?, which was shortlisted for the Diva Literary Awards and longlisted for the Polari First Book Prize. The Breakup Monologues brings together all that she has learned from her own life and from conversations with her podcast guests, friends, fans, relationship therapists, scientists and sociologists. I wanted to take some of the questions that I've been writing about around lesbian heartbreak, lesbian intensity and complexity, and see what light Rosie's research might throw on some of these dilemmas. Oh, welcome, Rosie. I'm really excited to have you on. I think you're by the seaside today, are you?
I am actually. I'm down in Margate with my beautiful dog Dolly. So we've been on the beach. So I don't think you'll be able to hear the sea or any sort of particular seaside sounds. In fact, you might even hear some clattering because there's a building opposite where some men are dismantling some kind of scaffolding. So it might not. I might sound like I'm in a sort of very industrial city or something rather than actually gazing out at the sea.
Are you down there? Does it help you to write being by the sea?
It is somewhere that I often write. It is a little bit of a creative retreat for me. There's a lot of people nowadays who've been spending more and more time in Margate. So we're the kind of dreaded DFLs, they call them in Margate, the down from Londons, who come and buy little properties here and come and enjoy being here in the summer. But yeah, we have a little flat that we sort of rent out some of the time. So yeah, but it's a great place, really creative place, artsy place. Obviously, Tracy Emin is a very important figure here who's sort of renovated lots of interesting sort of cultural buildings in the area and that kind of thing, and is putting a lot of her own sort of private money into regeneration here and supporting new talent, new artists, and interesting cultural projects.
I had no idea. There, I've learned something about Margate.
Well, so there we are. We get to talk about another interesting, inspiring woman, as well as ourselves.
Yes, as well as ourselves. Yeah. So one of the things that you've been called, I think it was the BBC that have dubbed you the Queen of Breakups, and I'm wondering, is that quite a dubious title, or are you proud of it?
It's a funny one, isn't it? Because I suppose if you're the Queen of Breakups, does that mean you've had loads of breakups, and does that mean you've had loads of really dramatic inappropriate relationships that maybe shouldn't have ever started? Or does it mean that actually you're the queen of doing breakups quite serenely and maturely? I hope that I've sort of moved from one to the other and shown some kind of growth. But yes, obviously it comes from the title of my book and podcast, The Breakup Monologues. And so when Radio 4 interviewed me, I think it was actually when they interviewed me on Saturday Live about the podcast, and the book was still very much in development and not out yet. They did christen me the Queen of Breakups, because I like to reframe them, if you like, in a more positive way as these opportunities for reinvention and growth and transformation, because we do get this time to reflect and heal and maybe think about the change that we might want to make. Whereas I do think within a relationship, sometimes personal growth and change is more difficult because you've got another person's needs and schedule and desires and dreams to think about and factor in. So sometimes it's great to get back to just you and what you need and what you want, and redefining what your boundaries are, and all the things that you want to sort of put joy back into yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, because I think that to be with somebody, no matter how good the relationship is, there are parts of us that don't grow and don't develop. It's just the path that we've chosen, and there might be other parts of us that really develop in relationship with that person. But there's always a compromise in our personal development when we're with somebody. Now, you might know, I'm not famous like you are, but you might know that one of my areas is working with later in life lesbians, and these are women who come out later in life, many of them having even believed they're straight. What you might not know is that one of the main reason people have been coming to me, or women have been coming to me, is to do with the breakup. And this is usually their first breakup with a woman. And I found that when I use this phrase, you've never had your heart broken until it's been broken by a woman, that people started flocking towards me as if I held some magical understanding of this. So your book is absolutely on my list of recommended books for these women.
That's interesting then. So you're not talking about the breakup that they've had with the male partner that they were with, their husband. I mean, I guess there might be a lot of practical elements to that breakup, shared childcare and that kind of thing, and sort of just the practical elements of, separating your sort of financial assets and so on. But yeah, I know what you mean. If you are a woman somewhere on sort of lesbian, bi, queer spectrum, and you do fall in love with a woman, there is a different sort of there is a different texture to that, isn't there? So yes, perhaps I can understand why there might be almost a newfound intensity to heartbreak when you first have a breakup with a woman. And also, I think many women find first getting together with a woman, even if you do it young, what I did when you're still a teenager. I mean, it's obviously terrifying when I was in the 80s and COVID time. But, the first time you get together with a woman, that feels incredibly intense, because women do seem to have these ways of connecting, very communicating, relating to one another, finding empathy with one another, which are quite suffocating in really good and all consuming in good and bad ways.
Yes.
There's a lot of psychologically amazing stuff, but psychologically quite difficult stuff that goes on in romantic and sexual connections between women. And a lot of that stuff without sort of wanting to be critical and sort of say that lesbians are so intense, which is what a lot of people do say.
Yeah.
I think you also have to look at that in the cultural context of why might that be, and why our relationships just might be under so much more external pressure and scrutiny.
100%. I mean, that is, I'm really excited that we're going to get to unpick some of this, because I've been forming these ideas, but with very, very few people to really discuss them with, apart from my wife, as it happens. But
that's quite good to have.
But you, I think when you mentioned about the breakup from the men, something that I've really come to realise is that a lot of women grieve the relationship with a man for years. so that by the time they split
Before.
up, yeah, so by the time they split up, they're there now. Sometimes the man realizes, but quite often he's completely surprised that she's been
Oh,
unhappy for 5, 6, 7 years. And we'll have to go into that another time.
yeah.
But I think we're going to talk a bit later on in more depth about the divorce rates amongst women, among same-sex couples, and this almost ease with which women can begin to leave unsatisfactory situations. So my area with the midlife lesbian, this is the woman that has perceived herself or has been perceived by others as straight, is that the estrogen, which I think really helps us put up with a whole lot of shit, really, that drops. And the oxytocin that we get so much, if we've had children and we're doing that sort of caring role, that it sort of softens us. And my personal experience is that I went into my straight marriage as a feminist, with a guy who understood principles of and was an ally of feminists, and then somehow I became a stereotype, and got lost somewhere. I'm going to blame hormones for a little bit of that, but of course it's the culture, it's the brainwashing, and it's the indoctrination in a large part.
Mm.
Does
Gosh,
it?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So there's something about the oomph or the power. I think middle-aged women have more of, but maybe this my view is really I'm looking for your view as well. Maybe you've had that all along because with you being out earlier, you've already shrugged off the expectations. You've already said, I'm not going to do it, in a patriarchal way.
Yeah, well, but you sort of keep having to rub up against the patriarchy, even if you are a feminist, even if you are a lesbian, even if you are somewhere on that sort of spectrum of queerness and have the majority of your relationships and maybe many of your friendships with women, even if you're self-employed like I am, and a lot of the people you work with are women, you're still working within patriarchal systems. So it's very difficult not to have to keep coming up against some kind of challenge, even if the men that you do deal with are really great. And like you say, the feminist men, the good ones who totally get it and who are on our side. It's something about the structures that are in place around how we have to conduct ourselves as women. And I mean, we'll get on to talk in particular talking about monogamy, which I think is a patriarchal structure, and I think it is this strange paradox that lesbian women, certainly of my sort of generation, have clung on to monogamy quite tightly, and we've seen lesbian divorce rates, as you mentioned, actually rise and become incredibly high, and for lesbians to sort of start topping the divorce charts, if you like. So my sort of theory is that monogamy, even though we try very hard to subscribe to it, actually doesn't really suit us if we look at our sort of more natural romantic and sexual instincts and urges, and think about who we are in that more sort of animalistic and fundamental way when we think about our real drives, which perhaps when you start to think about yourself as something other than straight, you do start to tune into and try and listen to, but it's still very, very hard to stay on that path of following your own dreams and goals and desires when we're operating within a patriarchal framework. I still haven't quite solved it all and found the answers.
Well, it sounds as if, it's a simplistic level. you would go with trusting your drive, trusting yourself, but that we've run into this problem of the indoctrination and what we absorb. And just because you might be a lesbian all your life, it doesn't mean to say you haven't received messages such as you're a woman, therefore you are responsible for everybody else's emotional well-being. And
Yeah.
so, imagining, for people who are listening that haven't been in a same-sex relationship with a woman, imagining getting two people together who believe that they're both responsible for everybody else's emotional well-being.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, imagine how intense that situation is. And when you say that women are perhaps more forthcoming in actually calling time on a situation, a relationship that isn't quite right, and we do see these higher divorce rates before that civil partnership dissolution rates, we do also see women kind of working incredibly hard to uncouple in some kind of conscious way. I always say lesbians pioneered conscious uncoupling long before Gwyneth Paltrow. Don't believe what Hollywood tells you. It wasn't invented just back in 2014 when Gwyneth and Chris broke up. Lesbians had been having to do that for generations because, it's certainly back in the day, it was a very, very small and insular community. Lesbian women wouldn't have had the sort of public spaces that gay men would have had to meet and congregate and socialize and flirt and have sex and get together and break up. Lesbian women did that often in people's houses. There'd be a small group of lesbian women that would meet up regularly, and you couldn't break up the whole group. So you had to consciously uncouple really and separate very, very amicably and sort your stuff out together. So I do think there have been a lot of women who've worked very hard to separate in a very sort of sometimes quite slow, sometimes quite organic, sometimes very respectful way. I mean, it's not always like that. Yeah, sometimes there'll still be a cliche kind of screaming and smashing plates and slamming doors kind of argument. You can't completely avoid that. Even mature, serene women, we have our moments, and we should be allowed to have those moments of rage. But yeah, I think you do see women really trying to negotiate that in a way that, like you say, cares for the other person and perhaps other people around them in their orbit, mutual friends, children, extended families and extended networks of people.
It's quite a burden, really, I think, for women, as well as a bonus. This development of emotional intelligence that women are trained in from a very, very young age. So I think you're talking about some of the positives of that, but I think that some women in the demographic that I work with are perhaps hoping to escape some of the burden, the emotional labour and so on, and then with a shock they realise they're in a relationship with someone who wants their needs to be met, or wants to talk about the relationship, or has an opinion on perhaps a better way of doing things within the relationship. And I often,
there's even more emotional labour being demanded, right?
Exactly. And I think that for me was something I hadn't realised, but there was this sort of, even within the inequality of being in a relationship with a man, I still felt that I was somehow emotionally a little bit superior.
It's quite nice to feel that sometimes.
Sorry.
And feel like you're in charge and you're in control.
Yeah. Well, I was the therapist and I was the woman. So, and to be partnered with somebody who perhaps didn't think I was right about these areas has been a bit of a novelty as well. And I think one of the problems that we might have in lesbian relationships for women who are new to them is as an idealization, the expectations. It's a woman, so it's going to be perfect.
Well, I do slightly lampoon some of the straight women who have said to many, many, many times over the years, "Oh, I wish I was lesbian. I wish I was lesbian. It'd be so much easier." And I'm like, "Oh no, oh no, 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 no." I mean, aside from homophobia, which has made it really, really difficult to be a lesbian, and all those kind of political and structural inequalities, like not being able to have children or not being able to get married and have our relationships legally or socially recognized. There's all this complex stuff that happens because of those expectations of you as a woman in society. And there is the classic dare we mentioned, lesbian bed dare, which is, I mean, it's a little bit unfairly sort of tagged to lesbians. I mean, really, any sort of combination of human people will probably experience a decline in sexual activity, but we do see it most extremely in female-female partnerships, and that may well also contribute to the sort of high rotation through serially monogamous partnerships and high divorce rates. We do see sex sort of tailing off very abruptly. But then also, you might find that women are more honest with one another, and they might say, "I really don't fancy you anymore. I really don't want to have sex with you right now or anymore." Whereas with man, unfortunately, of course, we might see women going through with sex just to sort of keep the peace.
Absolutely. And I think as well that men suffer from sexism in the sense that in relationship, very often the only time they can really be close or let go or be vulnerable is through sex, whereas with women we can do it all day in 100 different ways, and it's through touch and conversation and looks, and so there's that ability to be received and to receive the other without having to go through what when you're tired can feel like a great rigmarole of having sex. It's like that is not the only way.
If we're going to be honest, especially a woman having sex with another woman, it's not usually going to be a quickie.
No, there doesn't seem to be any such thing. Yeah. So there's and there's expectations there, aren't there? That if the sex dies off, that perhaps that's an unsatisfying relationship. But I wonder how heteronormative that is.
Yes, but then equally, as I sort of explored in my first book that came before the Breakup Monologues is Monogamy Dead, which you've got in the background of your shot. So you've been reading it, which I very much appreciate. So when I was kind of writing that book and really thinking about these areas of monogamy, again, it's sort of going back to these patriarchal structures. I don't think we've necessarily come up with a solution for lesbian bed death and for what happens in a female-female partnership where that sex has maybe fizzled out, and the two women have become so close in all the ways you're talking about, emotionally, as friends, as as a team in all kinds of practical ways, because women are good at sort of organizing, aren't they, at kind of making things happen, at maybe they have got children or pets or a business they run together, or who knows what they've got going on. But women do sort of go into these different modes of, like you say, caring for either people or things, and making sure that they all run smoothly. And I think it's very hard when you get so enmeshed in all of those ways. How can that person be your kind of exciting new love interest as well as everything else? Esther Perel brilliant, therapist always says that, how can you desire what you already have? And women become so enmeshed with one another's lives, and there's so little separation usually when women get into that intense state with one another, that I think it becomes almost impossible to have sex with that person. I mean, I shouldn't be saying this, should I? Because,
you're not selling it.
I'm in a relationship with a woman. I'm married to a woman. I've been in relationships with lots of lovely women. But ultimately you get to a point, and I don't know. Honestly, I've not found the answer, because there's so many layers in a relationship that a woman has with another woman, but that I don't think there is enough distance to be able to be sexual with one another after a certain amount of time has passed. Clearly, there are some female-female partnerships that seem to navigate this. But I would argue that they do seem to be the exception rather than rule. And broadly, statistics about lesbian divorce and so on, and if you survey lesbians about relationship satisfaction and their sort of behaviour patterns, you will normally find that this kind of theory holds up. And you do see women, if you talk to a lesbian woman my sort of age, who's sort of in her early 50s, you tend to find she's had, maybe around 10, serious relationships.
Yeah.
Of I don't know, like 2 or 3 years each or something like that. And a big, massive, dramatic breakup that maybe they then eventually became friends. And now she's got loads of amazing friendships with all her ex-partners, like a big sort of family. Loads of people can cat sit for her and stuff. And but yeah, I think it is very, very intense. And I do think heterosexual women I know tend to keep more separation from their male partner because they have female friends. And this is one of my bugbears, is I actually think that is quite healthy. If you want sex to continue on in your relationship, I would say have separate friends. And this is something my wife and I don't really agree on. She always wants to have a group thing. And I think it's very, very healthy to have your own separate friends, have one-to-one relationships with people, and you can kind of talk to those friends about what you need to get off your chest. And if you need to have a moan about your partner, then you have a space to do that. Whereas if everyone is sort of friends together in this kind of rather muddled grey mass, then who do you go to about a problem?
Yes, and of course, one of the I was looking through some of your blurb and some of your writing to sort of look for this explanation of why people break up, and I think you just said, well, they might just be a dick, but if you if you don't have your friends to run these checks and measures by, it can be a bit harder to spot when you have lost yourself. But I think obviously I've come. Yeah, no, go on.
That idea of losing yourself, I think, is even more of a concern and issue to be aware of in female-female relationships, because women do invest themselves so completely in the new relationship. And there is the famous lesbian urge to merge, where you share one another's clothes, you adopt one another's kind of style, and I don't know, hairstyles or ways of being, or you start liking the same music or the same film, and you become the same person. But you mustn't do that. You have to retain your own sense of individuality and identity. And I do think it's about retaining some kind of separate relationships, whether they're friendships or even, as we discuss in the monogamy book, romantic sexual relationships.
Well, I have a different spin on that, and this is it's sort of controversial, because I think sometimes I just like to go against the narrative, and the narrative is so much about boundaries and everything. For me, it's about trusting trusting ourselves. So I talk quite a lot about this idea of safe uncertainty, and because I suppose, a lot of this is from my perspective as having grown up and practiced for decades being straight, is that one of the absolute pleasures and joys is to merge, is to fall in love, is to just just lose yourself, and that if you've got a healthy enough ego to trust the flow, to trust that you will re-emerge, that you'll dive into the water and then you'll come up for air, and to trust. But I think that, that's what's really missing, is our capacity to then let go. There's nothing wrong with falling in love and going into this lost space. It's absolutely, it's compelling, it's delicious, it's what all the love songs and poetry are written, write about. But it's something about having that capacity to to trust that your whether you call it your soul or your your true self will seek air, will move through that process. So the studies do show that that bonding process. So we also see this when somebody gives birth and they're the primary caregiver, that they merge with the baby, and the baby's cry is felt acutely by the caregiver, and so on. So the point of the merging, it does have a human point, which is that it helps strengthen that bond for when you go through stuff later on. So the memory of that and so on. And I like that you see the person not realistically at all. You see them as their best self, as their their beautiful potential and all of that. Just as a mother, when they say only a mother could love him, it's a bit like that when you're in love. So just because I have enjoyed it so much, I have a bit of a soft spot for allowing the urge to merge. But I definitely take your point. It's really dangerous if you don't have a strong sense of self. But I suppose I've come to it middle-aged.
Yes, which is different. Again, that'll be different from my perspective, where I would have done merging first when I was 20 or something, when you don't have that strong sense of self yet. So I have seen the negative effects of it when you're not in a robust enough position to do that. And I think a lot of women are very scared of it. And I think when I really felt that connection the deepest, the strongest, the other woman has run away. I could have gone exactly where you're talking about and dived into the pool. Well, maybe she's not run away, but swum away, whatever metaphor or analogy we're using. But yes, I think, I think with kind of modern dating and the way now that we select partners, there's a bit of a dissonance, I think, between head and heart, and between kind of choosing partners on a website or something based on very kind of quite spurious factors about what their likes and dislikes are. And so we're sort of ticking boxes, and it's not really about that sort of connection that you're talking about. It's about finding a partner who's good on paper. More like an arranged marriage, and it's arranged by the internet.
It's not a silly way to do it, I don't think at all. And in fact, I did go on a dating site, and I did, I found a few people who were really good on paper, which did include, my wife. but yeah,
And she was good all
yeah,
round then.
yes, we you know, I eventually got lost in the romanticism, but I think there's this. I think I'm just breaking a few rules because I deeply resent the stereotypes of lesbians and then the judgment that comes if you start being at all like the stereotypes. So just for listeners, could you sort of describe the lesbian relationship stereotype? You've referred to it already, but what's the classic stereotype?
Well, I suppose one of the main ones is when you first meet up, you rush so far into the relationship. The joke is that what does a lesbian bring on a second date? A U-Haul, because of course she's going to move in, and so and there is some truth to all of these stereotypes. That's the sort of slightly annoying, slightly hilarious thing about them all, if they do kind of seem true of many queer women. And yeah, you do see lesbians rushing into relationships and rushing out of them and moving through relationships, as I said, at this somewhat frantic pace, and this sort of search for connection and desire for connection with other women. So yeah, I think that is a stereotype, but it's hard to completely knock it when you see it actually happening in real life.
So part of what you're saying, Rosie, is that moving out of relationships is not necessarily a bad thing, and so you can see my point really, that moving into the relationship is not really a bad thing if we can stop assuming that the end of a relationship is a bad thing. Then we can stop trying to find reasons for why the relationship ended.
Yes, stop beating ourselves up about it. It's very much why the subtitle of the Breakup Monologues is The Unexpected Joy of Heartbreak. Because, hey, actually, these are the things that teach you about yourself, and you kind of figure stuff out. But again, Miriam, as we've been talking about indoctrination, we have been led to believe, haven't we, over years and years and years and years of messaging that we receive from everything from the sort of hierarchies of wedding anniversary gifts to the films that we watch, to the songs that we hear, that the longevity of a relationship is key, is this indicator of success somehow, when, of course, as we know, the real success is knowing when it's over and separating really consciously and in a way that allows you to have some ongoing love and respect and kindness towards one another. But it's not easy, is it?
Well, it's controversial. I think people are reluctant. Your book is Monogamy Dead. I don't think people are tuning in, listening to this to hear about that. They want us to be able to say, I'm just guessing, but that we've got some secret ingredient for making love last forever. And this is the dissonance that you and I have exchanged some emails about, because I live that dissonance. I'm really in love with my partner, and I'm sort of hoping that because I'm nearly 60 that we might make it till death do us part,
And you think that's really? I'm like, oh my God, it's just awful thinking that's the last person you're ever going to be with. You get the experience and joy of other new.
I'm just besotted. So, but but at the same, at the same time, I'm a therapist. I know the statistics, and I understand that people change, and you can't possibly make a decision one year that's going to hold good 5 years down the line. And I want more than anything is for me, for you, for all of us to just grow and develop. And that's also what I do actually want for my partner as well. It's just as long as she doesn't grow away from me, you know. So I'm living in this.
That's the point, isn't it? Growing away from you would still be her growing.
I know.
It would be hard for you to be happy at that growth, but you would have to be ultimately if you do really love her.
Yes, absolutely. And I do.
Why that would be the direction she'd gone if she ever went that way, but she probably won't because you probably are really able to communicate very effectively because of your background, Miriam, and that there probably is a lot to say for why your relationship probably would be successful and last a long time.
Well, this is where I'd like to go a bit deeper. So I'm just gonna suggest that we go to a break now, and that when we come back, that we really try and bottom out some of the reluctance to let go of monogamy and have a talk about where's that coming from, and why are we so scared?
Are you coming out later in life? Are you partnered with someone who is? The Women with Women conference has you covered. Meet like-minded people and hear from authors, therapists and specialists at a beautiful venue in Sheffield. The first Women with Women conference is set for June 2025, and with limited spaces, tickets are available at womenofsteel.co.uk. We'll see you there. This event is not open to men or straight people.
Welcome back after the break. I'm with Rosie Wilby, comedian, podcaster and author, and we're talking about relationships from a woman's perspective in general and from a lesbian perspective in particular. And we're just getting onto the meaty stuff now because the title of your book, Rosie, is Monogamy Dead. Like I say, I don't think that that's the answer that a lot of people want to accept. So you wrote this book 8 years ago, and you've developed your thinking since then. You did quite a bit of research into, this drive you were talking about, women's drive. Tell us about monogamy.
Well, like you say, the book came out 8 years ago, and I think since then we've seen the conversation really change, and people are generally, certainly in this country, a little bit more open to thinking perhaps slightly beyond those edges, those boundaries, those very firm boundaries we had for many, many years around monogamy and what that meant. And now we do see couples perhaps having open relationships, being polyamorous, as in having many loves, or having different ways of defining monogamy, being what some people might call monogamish. Some people looking the other way if their partner has a bit of a flirtation with a colleague at work or something. But all of this takes a huge amount of discussion as to what are the boundaries, what is okay or not okay in this relationship. And sometimes you'll mess up and get it wrong, but just keep talking and, keep sort of being human and being messy and just enjoy kind of that great adventure of having a relationship. It's the things that we don't do and we don't experiment with that we'll probably regret when we're too old to think about sex. So monogamy is it's an interesting one, and I think as we've touched on already in the first, lesbians have historically subscribed to a sort of rapid, serially monogamous model, and that does, I believe, illustrate some kind of quest or thirst or desire for more romantic and sexual novelty than we have culturally allowed women to have, or as women allowed ourselves to have. We subscribe to this notion, don't we, of a woman being more faithful than a man, when actually maybe if we were sort of let loose with our desires. We would want to just have as much wild sex as anyone. You know, and I went along, I talk about one of the early chapters in the Breakup Monologues, is I talk about going along to a sex lab and doing this very weird experiment where I'm sort of wired up to these machines which are monitoring my arousal as I'm watching various erotic. And I obviously, as a sort of comedian and writer, partly went to this experiment thinking it would be something quite peculiar and interesting to write about it, but also I was very interested in my own sexuality and sort of learning more about it, because I've long suspected that I'm not completely exclusively lesbian. You know, I am sometimes attracted to men and male bodies as well. So I found it a really sort of quite intriguing experiment, and it just, I think, indicates how culturally women tend to put themselves in boxes and identify with particular labels that can be quite restrictive in terms of, you know, what our actual sort of more kind of animal instinctive sexuality might be. So I do think that women do struggle with monogamy. There's certainly a lot of other books out there in the world that I've read, I've reviewed for various magazines that would suggest that as well. And I think it makes sense because, as we touched on in the beginning, monogamy is a patriarchal structure that is all about policing women's bodies and policing women's sexuality. So it does seem to me this irony that lesbian couples would want to be monogamous in the first place. I have never really experimented much with non-monogamy, but I think it makes a hell of a lot of sense if you can do it with the right amount of, well, kindness, communication and mutual respect that it would require to have a more sophisticated structure around your relationship, and one that it goes against the societal norms, and you would obviously again receive external pressures and prejudices because of that. But I think it's something that it really is worth having a conversation about if you're in any way not happy in the type of relationship that you're in, if the sex has died down, but your relationship is great in lots of other ways. Why not have a conversation at least about whether you could be comfortable having romantic and sexual relationships with other people as well? It doesn't have to be a terrible or the sign of your relationship being wrong. It could be a model that could really work for you. So why not at least have a discussion and put it there on the table? And I think it's becoming less taboo. And it's been fun to be a little bit of a part of that discussion. But certainly it was when I did the comedy show with the same title that preceded the book, there were people who were coming along just to be offended because they'd seen the poster, they'd seen the title, and were like, "Oh, I don't know about that."
It's scary.
We're scared, aren't we? And challenged it, especially in British culture. We are funny about it,
And I think it's across the board that we are scared by uncertainty, so we want to pin things down, that we will be together forever, or that we always have this for tea on Monday. People really, really like that, and they hate uncertainty, not knowing when something's going to happen. And we're living in quite uncertain times at the moment, and we did when we went through the pandemic. And what people look for is the certain thing. So this quest for the perfect relationship is looking for the relationship that will last, rather than the relationship that will help them grow. And I think that the idea that I want to support women to really develop is this, that the thing you can trust is yourself. You can trust that if your girlfriend leaves you, you'll be okay. You know, you might be unhappy, you might lie on the floor and refuse food for a few days, but you'll be okay. That, you know, that if it doesn't work out, that, you know, you will find new interests, new love, new stimulation, and just trusting that there's loads of benefits to a single life. You know, this is something I want to explore in future episodes as well. So this is a concept that I call safe uncertainty, which I've borrowed from a different model, and it's the idea that everything can be uncertain around us, but we can feel safe with ourselves. The person who's in charge is safe. I'm safe. And I can be responsible to myself. And this is where that returning to the sense of self, journaling, meditation, walking your dog by the sea, whatever it is, that return to self is reliable, will be there till the day you die. This woman is going to be by your side, and that's you.
Yes, absolutely. No, I absolutely. And I just, when you're talking about pinning things down, that to me sounds like you're sort of pinning some kind of specimen, like an insect that you're collecting. And of course, the act of pinning it down means that it's dead, right?
Yeah.
And it made me think of a kind of a cute story I don't think I've shared on any podcasts. But when I was a kid and Santa Claus had been on Christmas Eve, and one of the presents I got when I was quite a little girl was a space hopper. I don't know if you remember in the 1980s, we were all bouncing around on our little space hoppers, and they were super fun. And it was a big orange ball, and he had a big old smiley face. And I got up, and I got up really early before my parents got up, and I thought that my space hopper that was sort of sitting in the room, and they thought I wouldn't see him until, I don't know why I ascribed him a male gender. That's very unfeminist of me. But I saw this space hopper, and I thought he looks a bit cold. And so I used to, as a kid, carry around a little sheet, a little sheetie like Linus, that's my little comfort blanket. And so I decided I would wrap this around Space Hopper. But then, of course, it just kept sliding off because he was a big round ball. I remembered, there were some pins. You see where this is going, Miriam. There were some pins that I was able to use to pin the blanket on Space Hopper, and it was going to be all warm and cozy, and I was taking care of him, right? And of course, Space Hopper was a very deflated little flat pancake by Christmas morning. And so I sort of over-nurtured him. I suffocated my this thing that I wanted to care for.
Yeah.
I mean, it's better to learn with a sort of inanimate object than with, I didn't sort of kill a dog or something. But I think it's a sweet metaphor for how we sometimes just suffocate things to the point that they are gone.
Yes, yeah. And in an ideal world, coming back to the lesbian relationship, we've got two women with two decent senses of self, who can say, I'm feeling a bit suffocated, I'm going for a walk or whatever. But that we actually partner with real human beings who have hang-ups and baggage and insecurities and traumas and all sorts of things. So you keep saying have the conversation. I think there's the conversation with your partner, but there's also the conversation with yourself.
Yes, definitely. And with a therapist probably. I mean, my wife and I met when we were both in therapy. I mean, neither of us had therapy for that long, but we just had a bit for a time when we first met. It was really great that we both had that separate space. I don't necessarily, I've never kind of liked the idea of becoming too reliant on a therapist and sort of having long-term you might think that that's a good thing, I suppose, because that's your business. But I I just had therapy for a short time, but it is interesting how you can feel, you know, I mean, you can see it in yourself, you can really feel in the other person their lack of having that space now to sort of talk through the things that they and how healthy and what it had been in that early time for them to have that.
It's quite interesting that you bring up about that my therapy approach, because that's changed along with me, and I think, again, I don't have a judgment about this is right and this is wrong, but I think that when I was a mother of real live children, that I was quite gifted at helping mother my clients' inner child, and to really intuit and see that aspect. And I'm actually far less interested in that now. And it's to do with my own aging. I'm really interested in strengthening that relationship between my client and her inner voice, and preparing them for the ultimate aloneness. And this is quite a big part of existential psychotherapy. Is that Irving Yalom writes that there are 4 existential truths, and one of them is that we are ultimately alone. The others are,
you mean when we die? Is that what you mean?
No, in life. He says that everything you bring to therapy, whether it's an eating disorder, a relationship problem, whatever, will come down to one of these 4 truths. It's that we're all ultimately alone, we're all going to die, life has no apparent meaning, and we're responsible for our actions.
Yeah.
And as much as that sounds like a whole load of four different downers, it's actually really liberating, because if we can face that, then we don't have to do all these complicated things to avoid it. And I think that a lot of our relationship problems are avoidance of that we are ultimately alone. And and so if we can marry somebody and we've got them forever, then we're trying to avoid the aloneness.
Well, but I also think I've been thinking a lot about how the ideas and constructs around marriage and monogamy try to strip us of our autonomy. And perhaps, yes, like you say, trying to fool us that we aren't alone. When I agree that we are. And if we are alone in the world, I think we should be allowed the autonomy to make decisions about, in particular, what we do with our own bodies, and how we use them. And so this is my real bugbear about monogamy, and that's where I've changed, is that when I wrote the book, I suppose I was thinking about the limitations monogamy imposes on us, in terms of we have just limited ourselves to the one partner, and we perhaps miss out on all these other fleeting moments with somebody who's there in the distance, who might have been an interesting partner were we single at that particular moment. And I suppose I thought about all those missed chances and those kind of people, if you had multiple relationships, I mean, yes, there's a limit. You couldn't have a relationship with an endless list of people, but perhaps there's lots of opportunity for connection we're missing. But I started to think about it from the other perspective, and what a burden it is to be the only sexual outlet for the other person, or primary partnership. And it strips you of any autonomy for making decisions about your own body. So many women now are choosing celibacy, and this whole celibacy movement, and seen as this triumphant, empowering thing, like, actually sex, perhaps in many cases it's heterosexual women sort of denouncing sex with men for a time, and they're kind of saying, well, that hasn't been doing it for me. And, the men that I've been in relationships with and had sex with have been dicks, and have not treated me with the respect and love that I deserve, and so I'm going to be celibate. But if you're in a monogamous relationship, how can you choose that without then having stripped someone else of their agency and their choice. So I
Yes.
think this is something that I find incredibly difficult. How can you make choices about your own sexuality if you are tied together in this way? And that's something I find particularly thorny and interesting. I'd love your take on that.
Well, I think that bit is really interesting about if you as a partner decide, I'm not so bothered about sex, that you've made a decision on behalf of two people, not one person if you're monogamous. And and hence all the, what we call the, these power dynamics, that, particularly in heterosexual relationships, that's one of the, noted power dynamics is it's seen as withholding affection. But we've got to be,
it's seen as that, isn't it? But actually, I think about when I was in the relationship that spurred me to write the Breakup Monologues, and when I probably was the closest to being in the pool that you talk about, completely losing myself and in this wonderful limerence kind of state. And ultimately, that relationship did become too intense. And it was her who sort of retreated. And then, of course, in classic attachment style, kind of the way these things work, if someone is going to be very avoidant with me, that's going to make me chase them even more, of course. It's kind of quite compelling, isn't it? It's like, oh, and you think you can win them back, and you're very seduced by this idea. But if someone is withholding affection, I'm not sure it is this power game that I thought it was. I think actually she felt very disempowered. She ended up cheating on me, which I thought was this terrible thing. But actually now I'm much more forgiving of it, because I kind of think she felt she didn't really have, she didn't have anywhere else to go. She felt backed into a corner.
Yes.
Because our relationship wasn't working, it felt suffocating. And I was the one who was saying, oh, we should be having sex, or we haven't had sex for weeks. All of those things, kind of gaslighty things to say, but I didn't know that then, because I'd been fed all this information about how regularly the average couple has sex. And so I thought, well, what are we doing wrong? What's going wrong? Do we need to try and light, fancy scented candles and, have a bath together, or I don't know, do something creative together, or do something fun, or, you kind of, there's all this bullshit, isn't there, really, about what you're supposed to do if you stop having sex, and you're supposed to rekindle things. And I just think, actually, she just didn't want to have sex with me anymore. And I needed to just woman up and get used to that, instead of, like, putting pressure on her. But I wish I'd known that then. But we don't say that. Society doesn't tell us that. Society is like, oh, there'll be a way that you can fix and heal your sexual connection. There could be, but sometimes, that part of the relationship might be over, and you might need to just accept it. Yeah. I wish there were better ways of communicating that, because I've certainly been on the other side of it and been the person withholding sex, but I've done so because I don't want to have sex that feels completely wrong and traumatic. Why I put myself through that? It's not a particularly empowered choice, I don't think, and particularly when it's usually women that are making that choice. It's usually women who are sort of given that tag, isn't it? That they are withholding sex or withholding affection.
Exactly, yes, and that's, I think that's so important in what you're saying. So, on the one hand, we have women who are having sex with men when they don't want to, and that is, that's just appalling. Yeah. And then this other end of the spectrum that I haven't really explored, if I'm completely honest, which is that when we might choose to not have sex, we also make a choice for somebody that we are in a monogamous relationship with.
Yeah.
And and there's something about where the power is, and and if there even is power, because the way that we've been indoctrinated again is to keep measuring. We measure the worth of relationships on how much sex is being had, but as women, we also measure our own worth on how the relationship's going, which is measured by how much sex we're having. And so, you know, we are at the mercy of the measuring systems that we continue to use. And I think I'm just about getting it, Rosie. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, yes, and it's complicated, isn't it? And I'm just trying to find answers. But I do think these are complex and interesting questions, and certainly these are ones that I'm exploring and pondering and thinking about at the moment. And if I could do an update of Is Monogamy Dead, there'd be a lot more I'd want to say. But I mean, I said a lot of things, and there's a lot of stuff I read it back now, and I'm really proud of that little book. It was just with an indie publisher that actually ended up going out of business. It was a horrendous experience, but then fortunately another publisher bought it out, so the book lived on. But it was a stressful time because I poured my heart and soul into it, and I knew I was talking about something important that really affected all our human relationships, but in particular looked at women's relationships with one another, and in particular when those are sexual and romantic relationships, and the particular sets of pressures on those, and what we need to do when monogamy becomes a really complex question.
I take that book all around the house with me. I'm so grateful for the work and the research and the thinking that you've done, so that you know, I can inform my own writing as I'm working on my book. So just for listeners, Rosie's books and forthcoming gigs are all in the show notes, and you can subscribe to her podcast and mine, please. Remember to support all the independent women of steel by checking the show notes on each episode and following them on social media. We all need this support for our voices to be heard. Rosie, we're coming to a close now, but I'm hoping it's a temporary close, because I feel like we've scratched the surface, and we could talk for hours on this.
We will be talking more at the conference, obviously, in June. So
yes, and people can come along if they're coming to the Women with Women conference. They can talk to you. You can sign their books. You'll have some copies of your books there, and they can submit some questions to you if they want to do that. So you know, I'm hoping that we can continue this conversation, but even the conference isn't going to be enough. So as we close, if a woman has listened in and is feeling particularly hopeless about love and relationships with men or with women or both, I'm wondering if you've got any words of advice that you'd like to share.
Well, yes, I would say I'm sorry if some of what we've said sounds a bit bleak, like we're being a bit doomy and gloomy about the reality of relationships and trying to give everyone a reality check. We don't want to douse flames on the romanticism completely, douse water on the flames of romanticism. But I do think it's very much what you were saying about finding that certainty within yourself and knowing that you will be okay, whatever happens, and to keep on nurturing that relationship with yourself, but to also make sure when things do feel tough, when you have had an awful gut-wrenching breakup like the one I had when I got dumped by email, that sort of inspired the book, to reach out to friends and to your networks. And the one thing that is great about sort of living as a lesbian is there are often strong community networks. There are often groups of women who, you know, maybe you didn't think you knew all those women that well, but actually there's a sort of sisterhood. I think still now, even certainly was the case when I first came out, the sisterhood was strong. Lesbians really had each other's backs, and now it's getting more complex as those identities entities are more fluid and merging, and we have different sort of different complex layered identities. But I think still those communities are really strong. And if you are a woman who is anywhere sort of in those complex areas, you will find strong support networks out there. You'd be surprised just how much support there is.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm sure that's helpful to a lot of people. And I would add, don't blame yourself. It isn't a failure. It's it's part of life, and
it's
I think
gross.
yeah, and I don't think that we've been all that down. I think we just sort of have somehow along the way turned into grown-ups.
Yeah, exactly. It's real life.
Thank you so much, Rosie.
Thank you.
After today's conversation with Rosie, I feel we've begun a conversation that I only want to continue. As Rosie continues to explore a conflict between monogamy and women's autonomy and choice over their own bodies, I have my own areas that I want to take from this. While she did suggest that I could be out there exploring all sorts of different relationships, I do feel as if I have enough to experience within the relationship I currently have. I greatly appreciate Rosie's provocation, though, as our conditioning is so subtle. We have to admit that our first place is to justify it. I'm thinking about how heteronormative conditioning makes women take responsibility for the quality of their relationships. And this is measured often by the amount of sex within the relationships. So it follows, therefore, that if we continue to use this rather suspect measuring tool, then we could become complicit in our own coercion into having sex that we don't want in the first place. Or at the very least, sexualizing connection which needn't be sexualized. So the starting place, I think we agreed during this conversation, has to be a capacity to say no, and for that to be respected by others and supported by the structures around us. We need to not be browbeaten into doing anything with our bodies that we don't wish to do. And if we start there, then maybe we'll feel safe enough to begin to let ourselves know what it is that we want to say yes to. Thank you for listening to Women of Steel, created and hosted by me, Miriam Grace, psychotherapist at Blue Skies. If you'd like to know more about my work as a therapist and writer, you can follow me on social media. Please take a look at the show notes for information and contact details. And in the meantime, be kind to yourself.